Thank you, Steve. As you can see from the video, I am the shortest member of the TCANZ committee, but that doesn't reduce my pleasure in introducing our very first keynote speaker for today. It is our honor to start our conference with Dr. Tony Self of Melbourne, Australia. He has an illustrious career as one of the pioneers of hypertext and online documents, including a PhD in semantic markup languages. He also has CTO roles. He manages the business HyperWrite based in Melbourne. He is the Director of Training for TCANZ. Importantly, he is a fellow of the Institute of Scientific and Technical Communication in the UK, otherwise known as ISTC, and in 2011, he won the ISTC Horace Hockley Award. Most of all, he's provided long-term support to TCANZ and to TCANZ members seeking growth in the field and data support. Please, another warm welcome for Dr. Tony Self.
Okay, I think we're ready to go. Good morning, everybody, and it's an honour for me to be the opening speaker at this conference. So I hope I set the tone at a particularly low level so that the other speakers that follow me have got somewhere to move. And in fact, I'm going to be quite disjointed in this talk, so I'm going to jump from this point to this point. Because as Steve mentioned in the introduction, there's many reasons for going to a conference, and you get a lot out of a conference. One of the purposes of a conference is to get ideas circulating, to use the time that you're spending in this room, the adjoining room, thinking about the way you're doing things, thinking about better ways that you might possibly be doing things, just having the quiet time that you don't normally get in the workplace. So today my talk is called Choosing the Right Path, and it's really about the things that are happening in the technical communication world generally at the moment, and things that we sort of know, but we might not have noticed that we know them, if that makes sense. So let's start first of all with the rough overview of what I'm going to talk about. The things that people read from are changing, and we should know this ourselves. And so some of the changes are transformative and disruptive is that special word that's used to mean that it's so dramatic a change that it disrupts the status quo. And these things are happening under our noses. Reading devices in particular are evolving or developing at an astonishing speed. And what was science fiction in 2005 is reality now. And to a certain extent, that should not scare us, but that should really make us sit up and take note. And again, remember these conferences are a time for reflection, and so we'll reflect shortly on that statement about 2005 science fiction being 2014 reality. And the question that I'm hoping we'll all ask ourselves is, what are we doing about this? Like, what are we going to do? How are we going to respond to this? Are we currently responding to this? What's the point of it all? Where are we going with this? And we're the creators of reading content. And if these changes are in reading devices, surely we should be really excited and agitated by these changes. But let's jump first of all into a fact, and that is that nobody's buying personal computers anymore. And that's a bit of an over. I'm overreaching a little bit. So this graph is quite old, that it's 2 years old or 1 year old, and this is showing the sales of computing devices by genres, where they've said there's desktop PCs, there's notebook PCs, there's smartphones and tablets. And so I realise that this might not be easily, the words might not be read from the back of the room, but the yellow and orange ones are desktop and laptop PCs, and the green colours are the smartphones and tablets. So you can see that pretty much the personal computers as we know it, the growth of those has stopped. So now the sales are static, but the sales of mobile devices is increasing dramatically. So much that when you start to look at the number of sales of devices and the usage of devices, we'll find that people don't browse the web on personal computers as the majority anymore. So the majority are now browsing the web using mobile devices. Now, I've just used the term computing devices because if you walk into a computer shop or an electronic shop today, you'll find a vast array of things that are probably computers, and certainly 10 years ago we would have described them as computers. So if you think about your mobile phone, your smartphone for example, like that's a computer, it's a fully fledged computer, or at least 10 years ago we would have said that's a computer because it's got computing power greater than my desktop, it's got a word processor, it's got an email package, it's got a web browser, it's got different applications that run within it, it's got networking communications, it's got the whole thing, and oh yes, and it makes phone calls. So that's effectively a computer, but we don't, if we said, do you have a computer with you? So no, I've just got my phone and my car keys. So when we look at tablets, it's also harder. Are tablets computers or what are they? So we wouldn't probably describe them as computers. So we've had to use the term computing device, and that's still pretty rubbery, because as we'll find in a moment, is an ebook a computing device or not? So it's no longer clear what a computer or a personal computer is. And if we then start to bring this back to technical communications, is this really relevant? Does it matter to us, or are we just talking about what device we write our content on? So yes, most of us still write our content on traditional personal computers and notebook computers. But is anybody here writing content on tablets at the moment? Yep, so the first are doing that. Maybe editing content on tablets, reviewing, sort of thing. Checking email on mobile devices as part of your workflow. Yep, it's pretty much everybody. So these things are very relevant. And we need to rethink these things because the speed at which this change is happening means that we have to do something about it now. For example, should we be doing anything in PDF? And just for my personal experience, I got a smartphone, and if somebody sends me an email or if I follow a link to a PDF on a website, so I go to a website and it says, oh, here's the instruction manual, click here, then what happens on my computer, my mobile smartphone computer, is the PDF downloads in the background, ends up in a downloads folder, then I have to go and find it and open it, and then it opens in a PDF reader on my mobile phone, and then I have to zoom out, zoom in, slide across, slide up and down, and it's a pain to read. So we should know that technical communicators are the advocate for the user. So who the hell did that? Who was advocating for me as a user in that case that put that user manual in a PDF form so that it was difficult for me to read? So, and we should be taking this moment to be a little bit introspective about that. Another thing that I think we should be thinking about is that question of how my content looks. And when you have the social discussions, the networking discussions that were on the video there, with people chatting animatedly during a conference, you will often hear people talking about the importance of kerning, or how typography is critical to the message, and how you're trying to manipulate white space, or you're trying to get some indenting to work. Now, another thing that I think we should be less focused on is how my content will look, because in many cases we're seeing the splinters, we're not seeing the forest. So yes, we might be working and spending a lot of effort on getting our PDF to be millimetre perfect, and then as I said, somebody's browsing that on a mobile device and they can't read a bloody thing. Or we're mucking around with spacing and white spacing for a big widescreen desktop monitor, and then somebody's looking at it on a tablet and the text goes off to the side of the page. And again, I think we could be focusing on the wrong things. So yes, there's still, and I'll still argue with everybody else that the way something looks is important, but I'm talking about the priorities here. Another thing is the table of contents. So for many of us producing help systems, one of the things that distinguished a help system from any other website has been that it's got a table of contents. It's got a tree to the left of the content, and people can navigate using this table of contents tree. But I think we need to re-examine that as well. Do we really need this table of contents tree anymore? Does the table of contents actually start to inhibit the reading of the content, the way people behave when reading on mobile devices or or on other emerging computer devices, is that going to be an impediment rather than a help? There's the issue of Flash and HTML. So are we producing Flash content? Is that a good idea? And the answer to that is probably it's a bad idea. So we should be adopting HTML5 standards of presenting interactive information rather than the Flash method. And many of you will be aware and have seen the parody videos about Flash not running on iPads and so on. And so Flash is more or less is now a dead-end technology. So we need to be aware of that so we don't invest any more or waste any more time in that particular technology. One of the predictions on the graph we saw previously was the detail of it was that enterprises will only buy 28% of computing devices sold in the next year. So let's just think about that. So enterprises are only going to be buying 28%. So who's buying the rest of computing devices? And the answer is, well, it's just consumers, normal people like us. And that's led to another dilemma, which I'm going to get to in a moment. But remember I said I was going to jump around a bit? I'm going to tell you an anecdote first of all. My oldest daughter is now a social media coordinator. And so she, as the name implies, she looks after the social media assets of companies. So she works for a marketing company and they look after the social media assets for some of their clients. And one of their clients, I call it Fat Busters. I think it's not called that. It's some sort of a diet program company, and they had some sort of seminar that they were trying to invite people to, an event of some sort, and they were trying to invite people to that. And they had it was an online sign-up, so they had on their site a beautiful online sign-up form. And then they complained that they weren't getting any sign-ups. And when my daughter looked through the statistics, she found that for every one person visiting the site on a desktop computer, there were 38 people visiting on a mobile device. And the site, the company had two sites, a mobile site and a desktop site. The mobile site didn't actually have a sign-up form. And they're saying, how come we're not selling anything? And that's because they made this dreadful assumption that we're at risk of making that, but our customers don't use mobile devices. Yes, our customers do use mobile devices. And if they don't use them now, they're going to use them in the near future. Which also leads on, now I'm jumping back to that other idea we thought about, which was that enterprises aren't buying computers instead, or computing devices, instead consumers are buying them. And what that's led to is something called BYOD, or bring your own device, which is in a workplace, people are now expecting that, or companies are expecting that their employees will bring in devices and use those devices in the workplace, bring in their own devices. So, and I was having a chat, I don't know who he is, with Mick last night, Mick McMahon, who's another Australian, and I apologise for him. He's not like the rest of us. But Mick does work in a very controlled environment where it's a sackable offence to bring in a USB drive or to connect to your mobile phone, but that's a rarity. And when you think about that, trying to enforce that, I go on a lot of planes, and although they've relaxed the standards, for a while the message that they gave in the pre-flight instruction was that if you turned on your mobile device during flight, it could interfere with the plane's navigation equipment, and the plane could catch fire and plummet to the earth in a fiery ball. But still, people say, oh yeah, but I need to check my email. So if the risk of death wasn't sufficient to stop people from connecting their computers, then a corporate policy isn't going to be a much benefit. So it is pretty much impossible to stop this bring your own device. And so clever companies are saying, rightio, well, this could save us money because we don't have to buy our own computers. We can have people bring their own computers in and use their own computers to do their own work. And so that might be mobile phones, it could be tablets, it could be laptops, it could be some other genre of computer. So when we think about that, that has a big effect on how our documents are delivered, because there used to be something called standard operating environment. We say, oh yes, but everybody's got a screen that's 640 pixels by whatever it is. But now we can't say that because we don't know what people have got. They might have Android, they might have Windows, they might have Apple, they could have anything. We don't really know. So that affects the way we develop content. Now, ebooks. Now, when I showed you that graph before, there was no mention of ebooks, and I also already raised the question of is an ebook actually a computing device or not? So this is sort of another story. Like generally, when people are collecting those statistics, they don't even count ebooks as computers. But like when you think about it, they have to be, don't they? They have to be, I presume there's some sort of computer. But there's some sort of distinction we need to make between an ebook and an ebook reader. So an ebook is an electronic book. So it's a book, it's words, it's a story. And a reader is a device that you use to read the ebook on. Does that make sense? So Amazon, for example, when they sell ebooks, they're not selling computing devices, they're selling books, they're selling novels. However, they also sell an ebook reader, which is a Kindle. They sell that, and that's a computing device, that's separate. But in many cases, there's still this question of is an ebook reader a computing device or not. So I'm going to come back to that idea, but we'll just leave it at this stage to say that an ebook reader or the ebook technology generally is a publishing medium. And so then as technical writers or technical communicators, we should be saying, whoa, that's important to me. Publishing medium is important to me. And ebooks are an alternative to paper, and that should be important to us as well. And the technology that most ebooks use is something called e-ink. And e-ink could be a game changer for technical communication. And it's one of those things that it's a technology that's there, it's mature, and it's ready for us to use, but very few technical communicators are using it. Now, I'm going to jump again, and I took a photo of this last night, but a lot of you will probably have these room cards with this special symbol on it. So this symbol means there's an RFID chip, a radio frequency ID chip in it. So that's a little chip that costs 5 cents or something to put in a card. And it doesn't have a battery, because when you think about it, how the hell does this open the door? You hold the card near the door and the door opens. You don't even have to touch it. So where is it getting its energy from? Like, how the hell is this happening? So is this science fiction or not? Like, how is this powered? So, well, I found out how it's powered, and so when you hold this near the door is powered, and it's sending a signal out. And this has got a little chip in it, and that chip gets agitated by the signal and vibrates around in there, and that generates enough electricity to power it so that it can then transmit back what its ID is, and then the little processor at the door can do something with it. So that's RFID. So that's literally, like, it's a couple of cents to put an RFID chip in there, so they're really cheap. So that's how that's done. Now, we're going to forget about that and go back to e-ink. So what the hell's that? So do you recognize, you must, yeah, that's, anybody want to guess? Yeah, a price tag on a supermarket shelf perhaps, and it's for a packet of potato chips, okay, and it must be in the UK because it's in pounds. So this is not science fiction, this is not a prototype, this is a photograph in a supermarket. And this is not paper, it's not a sticky label, this is electronic ink on a piece of plastic with an RFID chip in it. And what happens is when you want to change the price, you go around with a little reader and you go, chip, and the words change and dissolve on the page and the new price appears there. So just like in Harry Potter. So this is not science fiction, this is actuality now. So words on a piece of paper or on a piece of paper that plasticky thingy coated with a type of ink. And by the way, electronic ink comes in a bottle. So just to put things into perspective, and this is very much science fiction we're talking about, except it's fact. And that is cheap enough, that technology is cheap enough that it's cheaper than a sticky label. So when you factor in the cost of people taking off the old label and putting in the new label. So that's today. Now, let's think for a moment, technical communication. Could we use that for technical communication? I guess so. Couldn't we use that? How are people currently using it for technical communication? Well, also in the UK, you know those big wind turbines? You know these huge wind turbines that generate electricity, and they're on a great big pole, and they're about 1 kilometre high. And then when you think about, they need to be maintained. And I've actually seen some of these in California, and they actually inspect them by dangling a man or a woman on a rope underneath a helicopter, and they dangle them, and then they look at the top of the generator at the top of the tower. But in other cases, somebody has to climb up. So let's look at that problem. So you have to climb up, and maybe when you get to the top, you need to do a repair on this piece of equipment. So that means you have to take your repair manuals. So technical communication problem. So how do we do that? So do we give them an encyclopedia of paper books, tie it to their belt, and then they have to climb up for a kilometre to get to the top? And then when they get to the top, they then have to flick through page 47 while hanging on by a monkey rope. So probably not a good idea. So we could say, oh yeah, we'll put that on a PDF and then they can have it on a tablet. So even if, let's forget the PDF thing, let's say they have it on a tablet. So now they have a tablet strapped to their belt, and then they still have to climb up with the kilometre, they get to the top, and then how do you read? How many hands do you need to read a tablet? So 2? Yeah. Watch out. So you can't do something, you haven't got enough hands. So you need to take 2 people up there, one to hold the to hold the tablet. So that's not going to work. So what about for an idea that on the hatch? So when you do climb up the top, so what you do is you take a little USB drive, climb up the top. When you get to the top, you open up the hatch. With it reveals the generator at the top. When you open it up, on the inside of the hatch, there's a big piece of this, maybe A3 if you like, of this paper. And you plug your USB drive into that, and then your manuals, your entire library is available there and you don't need any hands to operate it at all. So that's also not science fiction, that's happening now. So some power generation documentation is being done that way. And there's USB drives you can get that provide the power and the interface to allow the ebooks or the content to display on a piece of e-ink coated paper.
I thought robots maintain power lines.
Oh yeah, maybe not. No, there's humans involved with this. Okay, so in fact I think I might have a little video here, see if we can get this going. So this is a piece of this paper, or this plastic, it's an acetate. This is from 2012, so things have moved on a lot since then. So it's got much better durability capabilities in paper. So you can see it can be cut like that. You can drill holes in it with an electric drill. You can try to set it on fire and it doesn't burn like paper does. So it has a number of characteristics. So again, this looks like science fiction, but it's not science fiction. So it also is fine with water. So you can, if it's in the rain, it'll still operate, which again is a problem with many forms of paper.
Tony, how expensive is it?
I'm glad you are. Who asked that question? Oh, that's a very good question. Thanks, Rebecca. So I think that's my next slide. Oh no, it's not yet. No, it's very cheap. So in the sense that you can buy a starter kit, which is one of those sheets of acetate, already pre-coded with the chips involved, plus an API and a USB port, so that you can plug it into your computer and start programming for it. And that's like $50 or $60, something like that. They're thinking that they can get the cost of the acetate down to about 12 cents. So then that's really cheaper than paper. So at the moment, it's probably around about the $5 mark, something like that. So depending on quantity. Now let's think about. So if we've established particularly that this is cheap, so this is not this incredibly expensive thing. This is a really cheap thing. Then what about on a power drill? Because effectively all you need for instructions to appear and disappear is to have a power source of some sort, and a tiny power source, even if it's an RFID chip. Then why don't you have your instructions for your electric drill on the electric drill itself? Or similarly, for a lawnmower, why wouldn't you put, instead of printing your lawnmower instructions, why wouldn't you put them actually on the lawnmower? It's got a power source as well, so you could use that. This is probably this time next year, or actually with the conferences in 2016, the next one. So I predict that in 2016, when we're talking about smartphones, then most of us will have smartphones with e-ink on the back of them, like this device. The idea here is that we're probably aware that one of the problems with smartphones is the battery life is quite poor. And so every time you go and check to see what the time is, you're consuming the power in the battery. And I think you're also aware that most people under 21 don't have a watch. They instead use their phone as a clock, and probably many of us in this room, even those of us that are older than 21, don't wear a watch and use their phones to check the time. So, but that's consuming power, so there's a downside to it. So why not have a piece of e-ink on the back of the phone, like as a second screen, and then use that to display information that you always want to display. Because something I didn't mention about e-ink is that it uses virtually no power. So, and it actually holds an image when you disconnect it. So, so it's not like a screen as we think of a computer screen. So it's effectively a powerless screen. Doesn't need any power. So it would consume virtually no power to have this sort of information displayed on it all the time. Oh, and by the way, I'll go back to this one. These are already available, so you can get these in. And one of the weird things with this, and this is interesting about science fiction and the price of things, is that some of the phone manufacturers that are producing these second e-ink screens, they don't actually wire it in, because it must be connected somehow to the phone, so it knows what time it is and how many messages you've got. So they're not actually wiring it in. They're putting a Bluetooth chip in the e-ink screen, and so it communicates via Bluetooth with something that it's physically glued to, which is really weird. So that's presumably, Bluetooth is presumably cheaper than wire. So that's really spooky as well. E-ink watches are now available. They're quite expensive. So I would have bought one, but I'm a cheapskate and I don't wear a watch, so because I can check my phone. But you can get e-ink watches, and they can also have Bluetooth connections with your phone. So as well as telling the time, it can tell you how many messages you've got or how many missed calls you've got. I think they're about $170, the e-ink watches at the moment. But yeah, that's probably not TechCom. Maybe it is. But certainly this would fit closer to TechCom. So this is not in production, but this is a prototype or a concept for medicine bottles. So when you think about how you get medicines, it usually comes in a bottle with a lid, a child-proof lid of some sort. Why not change the shape of the bottle and then have your instructions on the lid of or on the top of the container? So this is another e-ink application. So we could have instructions of some sort in this form. If we wanted to update them, then we can update them. The way these are done, by the way, is when the chemist makes the prescription, puts the pills into the canister, then they briefly connect up, or the canister is connected to the computer that would normally type out a label, and they press send, and it sends the words to the label. They then disconnect it. Because the e-ink holds the image, that's then held for the rest of eternity. So, and it never fades and so on. And I covered that. It's effectively cheaper than paper. So here's, well, I think this is actually wrong, but this was talking about $1 to $2 a piece. So I don't think this is quite right, but it certainly is very cheap. Now, for technical communicators, these facts and figures end up raising some potentially embarrassing questions. So what medium are we writing content for? So I'll just have a little pause so we can think about it. What medium are we writing content for today? So, and I probably won't embarrass everybody, but I'll just say, so some of us might be writing for paper and actually producing printed works on paper, on that old medium. Some are doing the cheats way of saying, oh no, I'm producing PDF, so that the customer can print out in paper. And some of us might be producing web content, and some of that web content might be designed for desktop displays. Some might be designed for laptops. but are they really designed for variable forms of reading devices? And one idea in there is something called reflow. So does the text reflow if the if the available screen size changes? Then, now that we've had a little think about that, what do you think users prefer? And there's one interesting way that you can test this and just ask yourself, how do you read the newspaper? So how do you read a novel? So many of us, actually we can do a show of hands, that's all embarrassing. Who reads novels on paper? So, yep. And who reads novels on Kindles or ebook devices as well? So, and who does both? Yeah, I thought so. So there's a lot of benefits there's pros and cons in either. So for those of you that are using Kindles, what would you, Kindle's a brand name, so those of you using ebook readers, what's the benefit, you would say? What are some of the pros? Yeah.
Getting it immediately.
Right, immediately, you don't have to go to a bookshop. Yep.
When you go overseas, you just take one plane.
Yep, just one, so it's lighter, isn't it? Yeah, which is something we didn't quite expect. So, yeah.
Books are much cheaper.
Yep, cheaper, yeah, that's right, yeah, yep.
I have far fewer bookshelves in my house now.
Yeah, that's right, yeah, but who would say that having far fewer bookshelves is a con rather than a pro? Yeah.
You can change the font size and the
yes.
contrast and things
That's
to
right.
suit your eyesight or your time of life or your time of the day.
Yes, yeah, that's right, yes, because you're quite old, Rhonda, so...
It doesn't hurt your face so much when you fall asleep either.
Oh, right, yeah, when it hits you because of the weight.
It's the 1,000-page wall piece hits you.
Exactly, yes. Yep.
So you can navigate your way around much more easily.
All right, yes, yeah, easy to navigate,
You don't
yeah.
lose your place.
Yeah. And you can search for things.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
what it is.
I can read at night without keeping my husband away.
All right, yes, yeah. So there's a number of advantages in there. But we're also having, speaking of people falling asleep, we're having a conversation at dinner last night, and I have to pick on Mick again. Sorry, Mick. But Mick was saying that he reads books, or some books he reads through audio. You know, the sound of people reading a book to you. You know, those, what are they called? Audio books, yeah. So that's another way, that's another form. So are we producing technical documents? Anybody produce technical documents for audiobook style with a narrator that somebody reads it back to you? With nobody? No? Well, here's another food for thought, and I realise I'm jumping around a bit. But I think all of us in the room come from either New Zealand, Australia, United States, any other countries represented? Germany, yep, okay. So France, very good. And India as well, okay. So we're still, I was thinking that every one of those countries is in the United Nations, and there's a UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, and there's also a World Wide Web Consortium Accessibility Initiative that effectively says, and I know like it's difference between unlawful and illegal or whatever, but it's discriminatory to produce content that can't be read by people who are disabled. So when we say all of us are producing content that is discriminatory in nature, in that it can't be accessed by people who can't see. So in fact, when we think about it, a lot of your content is capable of being used by an audiobook style thing, because most PDFs, for example, can be read out. You can ask a synthetic voice to read it out for you. And most web pages can also be read out. But we should be more aware of that and be aware of what those standards are. There's international standards for accessibility, and so we probably need to have a greater awareness for that. And I'm going to get back, I just want to keep on mentioning this as Hobby Horse, that a lot of technical communicators get PDF focused, and they think about PDF, and maybe that's not what we should be looking at. Maybe that's, again, in terms of where we're devoting energies, maybe that's a bit of a mistake. And I've had one anecdote about one of my daughters. My other daughter is an animator, and she works for an e-learning company. Now, who here does e-learning content? I know there's a few, yeah, quite a few people do e-learning content, and who do training manuals as well, that sort of thing. So it's in that same sort of sphere, so a lot of us are doing that sort of work. So You would think then that my daughter working for an e-learning company, so they specialise in producing learning materials, e-learning content. They have writers as well, so they've got writers, animators, graphic artists, etc. But no technical writers. They've never heard of technical writers because they've come from an entirely different field. My point here is that if we say, oh no, but we'll stick with PDF because we'll wait until this thing happens, if we keep on waiting, somebody else will move into our space, and then it won't be technical communicators doing these things. A little bit like the e-learning company with no technical communicators because they don't know they exist. They just moved into that space because there was an opening, because we'd left such an opening. And we've done that before in web development. So when technical communicators were some of the first people to be producing hypertext documents, because help systems predated the World Wide Web. So hypertext was invented before the web was invented, and so some technical communicators were working in that space, but the majority of web content is now not done by technical communicators at all. We missed that boat. So. And stuff happens really quickly. Now this is an amazing fact. So remember I started off by talking about science fiction in 2005? So if you try to remember what happened in 2005, and I realised Roy was on the spiffs then, but 2005, what did we use then for computing devices? But certainly, like who here's got a tablet computer at the moment of some sort? So that's pretty good penetration. So the iPad was released in 2010. So 2010, that's what, 4 years ago. So 5 years ago, there was no such thing. We didn't know about tablets, except they were on Star Trek. So in fact, this is these two photographs, you might have seen it before, at a papal inauguration. So there was the 2005 papal inauguration, and then the 2013 one. And that's sort of a good graphical illustration of the impact of tablets. So we need to be aware of this, that things happen quickly, and we don't have a lot of time to say, oh, well, we'll see if these things, it'll never catch on. We'll see how this affects me. We need to be a little bit more proactive and make sure we get right onto these things. Another often overlooked fact, and I know it's slightly different in the United States, but outside the United States, or worldwide is probably a better way of looking at it, worldwide, iPhones are not the dominant smartphone platforms. And it's interesting, I notice a lot on television news, etc., people will be, like newsreaders will be talking about an iPhone or an iPad as though it's a generic term. So, and in fact, I was giving a RoboHelp training course somewhere, and we were talking about mobile devices, and somebody said, yeah, they've got an iPhone, but it actually wasn't an iPhone, it was an Android phone of some sort, but they didn't realise that they're all the same, aren't they? In a lot of cases, people are developing this, I need to get on top of this mobile stuff, so I better develop some content for iPhone. And Apple takes a very proprietary mindset. So yes, when you develop something for iPhone, you only develop for an Apple. So it doesn't work on anything else. So that creates more problems than it solves in many respects. The iPhone, by the way, was released in 2007. That's another stunning thing. So using our 2005 benchmark, the iPhone was still 2 years away. So, and certainly Apple are very good at marketing. And so while these devices weren't necessarily invented by them, they certainly made them popular through force of marketing power. So that's probably that most of us hadn't heard of an iPhone or a smartphone or whatever we called it in 2005. And Nokia were the big things, and SMS was the future of the universe. The Android phone, by the way, was released in 2008. So the first of the Androids are there. But yeah, Apple's not the market leader, it's the marketing leader. Now another interesting point, and here's another, I'm going to jump across to another idea, open source. Android is open source. And open source is that sort of hippie thing where everybody shares and it's all lovely and let's not try to compete, let's just work together. Even our competitors, you're not really competitors, you're just friends. And that sounds as though that's a recipe for disaster or whatever, that's never going to work. But let's think about, what's probably, if you think about the biggest information revolution that's happened in your lifetime, what would you say that would be? The web? the web is open source. The web, all the web standards are run by committees of volunteers. They're hippies. And they develop things cooperatively. So the World Wide Web Consortium, I think, has about 700 members from 128 different companies that all work together. And it all is peace and love, and it works. XML is another set of technologies. So that's all open source. If you've got blue cables, that's TCP/IP that runs along that, that's another open source protocol. So there's open sources all around us. And Android is an open source operating system based on Linux, which is the most widespread operating system, not Windows or iOS, but Linux is. And Linux is open source. So open source is actually much more successful than proprietary approaches, which is sort of a little bit counterintuitive. It's hard to believe that. Android is a little bit more complicated because Google did something with it and then so took it proprietary, then released it back as open source. But one of the benefits is that usually money doesn't change hands with open source as well, which means that when you're buying an HTC or a Samsung Android phone, you're not paying any money for royalties to whoever developed the operating system, because it was developed by just people who weren't interested in money, they were interested in the benefit of humanity, which is kind of nice. Android is used in 74% of mobile phones, according to Gartner in 2013. So should we be designing for iPhone? Clearly not. We should be designing for all sorts of mobile devices, whether they're Android, whether they're Windows 8, whether they're iOS, or whether they're some other operating system that we haven't heard of. And that leads us also onto standards. When we talked before about the hippies running the World Wide Web, it's quite funny so HTML is a standard, CSS is a standard, and a lot of others, lots of HTTP is a standard, so there's lots of standards. But it's interesting they don't call them standards because they're hippies, right? Because standard sounds like rules, and that's a bit heavy, man. So they actually call them RFCs, which is request for comment. Here's what we think, what do you reckon? I hope it's okay. So the web is held together by these RFCs, these standards, but so we'll just call them standards. And so industry standards end up being important because it means we can cooperate with other people, we can share and exchange information without rework with other people. And the way, if we also think about the way globalization works as well, there's many changes in the way companies and businesses and services operate, so there's more and more cooperation in the world. And so we might have experienced this with our own company as well. There's also takeovers and multinationals and so on. And so many of us have been in the situation where we're working on one set of documents and we're taken over by another company who have another set of documents, and we need to merge our products. And if they're not using the same standards as us, we have to rework things. So wouldn't it be good if we all could play together nicely and we all use the same standard? So there's a big case for industry standards as well. And HTML5 and CSS3 would be two of those standards that are probably important for us to be working to. Now, never forget how quickly things move. So we've talked about 2005 and 2010. Now let's talk about this device. Does anybody recognize this device? This photo is from 2011. So to give you an idea, and this is the second prototype. The first one was a little bit bigger. So in fact, the first one weighed 3.5 kilograms. And this is what it looks like now. So this is Google Glass, and again, from a marketing perspective, I think most of us have probably heard of Google Glass, but there's many other forms of this device, this sort of wearable technology. So effectively, this is, for those of you who don't know, this is effectively a mobile phone that you wear like a pair of glasses, but it's also got a camera in it like most smartphones have, and it's got a microphone like most smartphones have. But what it has, which is a little bit unusual, is a head-up display, which means that in this little glass panel here on the screen, the information is being projected onto that. So that if I was wearing one of these and looking back of the room, I might see how much time I've got left on my talk displayed up the back of the screen. It's also got some really weird things, which are very science fiction-y. I'll come back to this one. I want to show you this example. such as I might be wearing these, I'm looking at this person, I say, who the hell is this? They look familiar, I've met them at a conference somewhere. And then I can see in my field of vision, this is Paul, and you owe him money, or whatever. And so you can then have this fake conversation. Hi, Paul, how was work at such and such? How are your kids, Mary and Jacob? But Google Glass is wearable technology, and it's natural for another idea, which is called augmented reality. So augmented reality is where we overlay something electronic, something visual, usually, over the top of the real world. So that example we saw before, where over the top of the real world there's some extra information being placed, that's augmented reality. Now, augmented reality is already being used in documentation. BMW, for example, have got an augmented reality device for mechanics. So they put on a set of glasses like that, and then they can see things that they're working on. So they see animations of what they're meant to be doing as a set of instructions. But I'll get back to that in a moment. This idea of the head-up display, that's actually been, like in Google Glass, like that's all cool and trendy, but somebody said everything has already been invented, like there's nothing new to invent. You can just sort of rejig things and make them smaller. So that's actually what Google Glass is. It's a head-up display which was invented in the 1970s and has been used in production since the 1970s, so for many, many years. But it's mainly been used in very expensive pieces of equipment, such as fighter jets. And you've probably seen, if you saw Top Gun, which was when was that, in the 1980s? And so if you remember those sorts of scenes where there's a little target following the aircraft on a little glass screen, that's a head-up display. So it can display all sorts of information in there. It's now used in passenger vehicles as well, and the new Mini, for example, which is like, oh no, it's not cheap, but it's not expensive either. So the new Mini has a head-up display as well. And and by the way, you can download a free app for a smartphone, and you then buy a piece of plastic that you stick to your windscreen, and then you can put your smartphone underneath your windscreen so that it projects up onto the piece of plastic, and then you can have your own head-up display for about $5 for the cost of shipping of the piece of plastic. So these things are around for us, but then we think, are these useful for documentation? One good example was Virgin Atlantic, which is an airline, have got like a lounge at London Heathrow, and their concierges, they call them, the lady that waits at the desk has Google Glass, and then when you say, what time is my flight leave, she taps the thing and says, Glass, flight 407, and then she sees the details, delayed 10 minutes, whatever, on her head-up display. So that's a form of documentation, but if we use our imaginations, we can find other ways that we can use that sort of idea for documentation. And I'll see if I can get this to play. How am I doing for time? I wish I had a watch. This explains a head-up display, and try to think about how you could use this in your documentation. Don't think of it as a cost, it's quite cheap. This is just an amateur video, by the way, so it's not. So that's the little head-up display popping up. It's a bit slow. Come on, get a move on. There we go. So it's booting. So is this a computing device? Who the hell knows? So it gives information such as what speed you're traveling at, your GPS navigation equipment, take the next right, that sort of thing. It'll give you other warning symbols. So if the engine's overheating, in this case, they're turning up the audio, so it's giving you feedback on that. So you don't have to move your eyes from the road is the idea of it. So, yeah. Okay, that's probably enough. Augmented reality, augmented reality can be used, at the moment the ideas are, oh, we could use this for tourist type information. So you look through your smartphone at something, and on your screen you see not only what the camera sees, but you see overlaid information on top of it, such as this is the Opera House and this is the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Okay, so there's another example that's in London. Some of these can be hooked into social media. Notice I haven't, apart from mentioning my daughter involved in social media, I haven't touched on social media yet, so that's another idea. But in this case, this can be, augmented reality can be linked with social media as well, such as don't eat here, the soup sucks, something like that. By the way, there's Audi, I think in their expensive car, I think it's the A5, they've got, okay, so this is relating it directly to documentation. Audi have an augmented reality user manual. So you download an app or whatever, and then you get that on your phone, and then when you say, what the hell is this instrument or this gauge used for, you just point your phone at the gauge, and then it tells you, it jumps to that point in the manual, tells you what it is, and in fact it also reads the gauge and then says, whoa, that's a temperature gauge, you need to put some water in the radiator. Because so it can not only identify what it is, it can identify the position of the needle on it as well. So, what's the Korean car company? Hyundai, yeah. They're using that for their manuals as well. There's you can implement it in different ways. So you can go really high-tech, or there's low-tech ways of doing it as well. So some of the augmented reality, there's software tools you can buy for augmented reality, and it's not particularly difficult. It sounds all science fiction, but it's not a particularly difficult thing. So it shouldn't be something we say, whoa, that's for somebody else, that's for, for Scotty or forever. It's not that complicated. It's something that we could do. So it's a matter of identifying things and linking them. Remember this idea that everything has already been invented? Augmented reality is a type of hyperlinking. That's a way of looking at it. I mentioned the BMW thing, so I've got the video here, so let's see if I can get that to work. So that's what the fellow's seeing through his glasses. Data goggles, they call them.
Remove intake duct. Outlet plug. Release screw. Inform tool. Remove fan towel. Install fan towel and snap in. Tighten screw. Clip line on. Install intake duct. Tighten 2 screws.
Okay, so we can probably directly see the relevance to technical communication there, because that's technical communication. So let's look at another example. Now, can we use this? This is being used for marketing. Can we use this for technical communication? Again, this isn't science fiction, so this is... Okay, that's being used for some medical equipment documentation as well, so that if people that want to almost have hands-on experience of something don't need to have the expensive piece of equipment. They just have to have a camera and the underlying CAD drawings, etc., and they can make this happen.
Tony, Freedom Furniture in New Zealand does the same thing.
Oh right, yes, yep, Freedom, yep. IKEA are doing something similar, and they have a television ad for it, which has you can sort of position the couch in your room. Is that like the Freedom one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so the reason why many of these things we haven't seen in technical documentation is because none of us have done it yet. So if that makes sense, so it's really up to us. It's not who else is going to be putting this stuff into technical documentation, unless we say, oh no, somebody else will do it for us. So this is technical documentation. So we may choose not to go into this field, but we should be aware that this field is available for us to go into if we want it. Is anybody working on IETMs or know what IETM is? It's Interactive Electronic Technical Manuals. And if you're involved with S1000D or some aerospace standards, then this is used a lot. So they use this term instead of what we might say online documents, which is probably a poor term because what online means two things. So they use IETMs, and there's almost a parallel universe in technical communicators that work on aviation documents. So this is an IETM in an aircraft cockpit. So, and there's a few, there's an aircraft theme running through this, isn't there? So maybe this should have been in the opening video. But you might have, in the olden days, the captain would have carried one of those great big flight bags. So there's now a thing called an EFB, an electronic flight bag. So they don't carry that, they carry a tablet computer instead. And they're allowed to use the tablet computers in the cockpit. And in this case, this one is embedded in the cockpit itself. And it's touchscreen, and you navigate through the documentation that way. And that is documentation. That's procedures, that's checklists, that's diagnosis, that's conceptual information, and it's information that's specific to the particular aircraft. So airliners, usually have modifications during their life that makes one airliner very different from any other airliner. So you need the specific information about that particular airliner, particularly if something goes wrong. Oh no, this has got a non-standard generator or something in it. So the documentation reflects the current status of that particular individual aeroplane. So I just mention IETMs, it's just in case you hear the term, it just means online manuals, but it usually means in the context of aircraft or military equipment. It's another interesting area, I guess, because often, the term rationalise, which means you invent a reason for something, for not doing something, or for it as an excuse for something. In a lot of cases, I hear people saying, yeah, but my readers are different from everybody else, or no, we wouldn't be allowed to have that in an organisation, and oh no, we have equipment and you can't have computers in equipment. So in many cases, you can have those sorts of things. And I did some consultancy work. It was actually some madcap flair consultancy work for a company in Melbourne. And they were producing documents and they wanted them to be printed. And I was saying to the person involved, why do you need the PDFs? Oh, no, because our users use PDFs. And I was saying, you sure? Because aren't they just people like you? Because the person involved was somebody that used to be one of these workers, so she was just moved to the office. And the real reason I think was, I know how to do PDFs, I can understand it straightforward, it's convenient for me. But she was saying, no, my readers, they don't like change, they won't accept anything unless it's PDF, and I can't do it online because they can't read online, they're really stupid. But then I noticed, I got in there early for one of my start days, and she was already at a desk, and like it was before work started, she had a cup of coffee, and she was reading her horoscopes, her newspaper, and a fashion blog that she was reading, all online. So that's what she chooses to read. She chose to read all those things online in an HTML format, but then was making decisions that said, oh yeah, but I'm different from everybody else because everybody else likes to read PDF documents or likes to have them printed. It's because they prefer to have them printed out. So we just have to be careful about that rationalization as well. I'm going to just chuck some other ideas now. Facets, profiles, and filters. Faceted navigation is a way of navigating through online documents without using a table of contents. So it's a way of filtering information. So you say, I'm only interested in red things, or I'm only interested in things with 3 doors, or I'm in this particular model of aircraft. And so you click on the things that suit your work environment, and the information is filtered down. The available information is filtered down to what's relevant to you as an individual user. So that's based on metadata. And so I'm also going to throw in metadata is increasingly important for us. And if we're not using metadata, we should be using metadata. So because metadata makes some of these things happen. So for example, you might be producing repair manuals you might have a suite of documentation that's used by a train company. And if an individual user might say, look, I'm doing a repair on the lighting system of a particular type of carriage. So they should be able to select those things, and then that narrows it down to the procedures that fit that criteria. Now that's closely related to profiling and filtering. So profiling and filtering, they're probably synonymous. Effectively means you can single source 2 different variants of a documentation based on that metadata. So maybe you could have a train repair manual and a train carriage lighting manual from the same source. But facets is done live, so that the user chooses what they want to see, and the filtering happens in real time. And obviously that can only work for electronic manuals. It can't work for captures of things, such as paper or PDF. So they have no paper equivalent. Now there's other stuff as well. This is a QR code, and I think this is the cheapest way of doing fancy things. So a QR code is it's a barcode, but it's sort of 3-dimensional. And all it does is it just stores information. It stores a piece of text. That's all it is. And so you can get, for nearly all, actually for every smartphone, you can just get a free QR code reader. And what you do is you point your phone at the QR code, and then it reads that and jumps you to the URL associated with it. Remember, it's just storing a piece of text, so it can store a URL. So what about if you had a whole lot of medical equipment in a hospital, and instead of having what they used to do, which is having manuals on laminated pieces of paper chained to the device, what about instead you just had a little QR code, and then people say, how do I repair or change the ink or whatever you do in it? Point it at, there's my instructions there. It's all up to date because it's being drawn off the web, so if there's changes, you've changed them in one spot. You don't have to go around and unclip all of the laminated pieces of paper and replace them. But that requires BYOD, doesn't it? So some of these things seem to merge together. So there's many things you can do with QR codes. And with video, you could link a QR code to an instructional video as well. So it's just a type of linking. Now I mentioned standards. Standards are probably a pretty important thing to adhere to. Now, So we're talking about technical communication, but we've seen some of the world outside technical communication. Now, all content creators have problems with non-standard and standard things. And that Flash idea is a good example, that developers used to work with Flash, then it's become non-standard because it doesn't operate on some pieces of equipment. And so, whoa, what are we going to do? We've got lots of stuff in Flash. So this is similar to our problems. So many of the problems that we're going to encounter with how do I get my stuff from here to here, how do I cope with this, or how do I do stuff on mobile devices, those problems have already been solved by other content creators that are a little bit more ahead of the curve. And sometimes they're stunningly beautiful and simple ideas. And HTML5 and CSS3 are good examples of that. They're really, really, really clever and innovative things. And they're standards that allow, they're a platform for innovation. And so it just needs us to imagine how we might use those things. And often it's methodology. So the technology is there, now we need to apply methodologies to it. And one such methodology is something called responsive web design. So it's not a technology, it's not something you buy or install, it's an approach. It incorporates a number of different philosophies, but it's a different way of approaching content delivery that just happens to be made possible through HTML5 and CSS3. And when we were talking at the start about mobile devices and how we have to create content for mobile devices and how it's stupid to have a web, like a desktop website and a mobile website, then that problem has been solved through responsive web design. And it says you have one site only, and the content recasts itself to suit the size of the device the person happens to be viewing it on. So our content responds. So instead of having different outputs for different devices, you have the same output, just with clever formatting rules, so that it changes the formatting based on the screen characteristics. It's simple, and it uses another philosophy, a methodological philosophy called mobile first, which says that we should be designing our content to be displayed on mobile devices. And we do that as our priority. And then we think about how this is going to look if it's displayed on a larger device. So we turn things around. And that's a big mental stumbling block, because that's where we say, I might need to abandon my table of contents, for example, because I can't fit it on my mobile device. And there's another idea. I used to love the term graceful degradation, which is where you'd have something in a high fidelity form, and you needed to display it on a poorer device, and so you gracefully degrade it. You take off the things that aren't important. Mobile first turns that around and says you have progressive enhancement. So you put the important stuff, the critical, vital, absolutely must-have stuff on the mobile device, and when you design for that. And then you say, I'll progressively enhance it if, put flashy things that aren't really important on it for the larger devices. But it really gets you to focus on what's critical and what's not. And I've just got, I should have this running in the background here, I think. This might be a bit tricky to do, so let's see if I can do it. And that'll bring me to a close. Okay, so this is just to give you the rough idea here. So let's see if I can get it to work. So this is a website just being displayed in Chrome, and it's done with responsive web design and mobile first. So this is how it looks on a desktop device. Okay, so it's got information like that, and it's got big pictures, etc. But as we make the screen smaller, we'll see different things will happen to it. So perhaps if we concentrate on the menus for a start. So as our screen gets, as the screen gets smaller, see how the images are changing, the content is mixing around, and then now we're down to this size. Our menu has disappeared, and now we've got this hamburger icon, it's called, and then our content then displays in a different form. And so as we get smaller and smaller, then it's still readable. And you'll notice the text size changes as well, because on small devices you need bigger text and so on. And so that's the quick introduction to responsive web design, which, as I mentioned, is a philosophical approach more than a It's not a technology, it's a methodology. So I'll probably just run to my conclusion, which is we happen to have at the moment this perfect circumstance of an environment for innovation. So we've got the tools available for us to innovate. So it's a matter of what we do with it. So I would suggest, my suggestion is forget about paper and pages and that sort of thing. It doesn't work for readers. Look at those innovation opportunities. Look for EPUB and e-ink. Think of ways you could apply those. Think about, don't be scared off by augmented reality. It might be something that you can apply that's really going to improve your documentation. Head-up displays or wearable technology. Responsive web design. Responsive web design to me is a no-brainer. We should all be doing that. It's cheap and easy, and it's only a small step from where we are at the moment. And it's mainly, we don't have to learn a lot more apart from a methodology. And others are already doing it, so we can lead on from them. So to do that, we need to let go of a few things. So maybe we need to abandon some of our preconceptions and completely revise our approaches, do things differently, actively innovate. And as Albert Einstein said, we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created those problems. So on that, I'll probably draw this session to a close. I hope that's been useful and thought-provoking, so thanks very much.